This is The Primary Nerd. Welcome, everyone. I'm Courtney, and I'm joined by my co-host, Brian.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming back and joining us for another exciting adventure in history.
Yes.
Yes.
And we have so much to share with you. Before we get going, though, I do want to mention that last episode, we had said that Titanic was about 400 miles away from New York at the time of collision. Correction. She was about 715 miles away from the port of Halifax, Canada, and 1,250 miles from New York in the United States.
Well, you know, we got that information, though, from a lot of Google searching.
We did.
And so...
We did. But here's the thing. I thought it was odd that I was looking it up because I saw a different number somewhere else. Mm-hmm. And once I started looking at I literally did this for probably 40 minutes to an hour last night, and no documents actually agreed. So all these different articles, all these different encyclopedia entries, and they didn't agree. So this is what I did, y'all. I took the coordinates from the sinking of Titanic, which is actually on Google Maps, by the way. And so I took those coordinates and I plugged them into this coordinate calculator and then got the coordinates from New York and the coordinates from Port of Halifax, Canada,
wow,
and ran the numbers and did the math. Okay, so I am confident.
All right.
Confident.
Yes.
715 from Port of Halifax, 1,250 miles away from New York.
Well, math is your friend.
Well, not usually, but a calculator helps. Also, coordinate calculator might be my new favorite thing. It was a lot of fun.
There you go. Oh, well done. Well done.
So, the plan for today's episode, we are continuing our exploration of the Titanic saga from the passenger's perspective. As we said, there is so much for us to discuss today, so let's go back in time. And still don't have a noise. Where we left off last episode, it is Sunday night, April 14th, 1912. Titanic is in the North Atlantic, south of the Grand Banks near Newfoundland, Canada. The passengers have had an uneventful day and a pleasant evening, but the cold that had plagued them all day was getting even worse, so a majority of the passengers went to their warm cabins to either read or go to sleep.
So despite the lateness of the hour, some passengers had not yet retired for the evening. So at 11:40 p.m. on Sunday, April 14th, 1912, some saw the infamous iceberg with their own eyes. So even before collision, first-class passenger William Sloper was having a memorable evening. He had been invited to join 22-year-old silent film star Dorothy Gibson and her companions as the fourth player in their bridge game. They were having such a good time that the first-class lounge steward had to interrupt and requested they finish the game so that the lights could be turned off at 11:30 p.m. Sloper was on his way to his cabin when, quote, suddenly there was a lurch and a creaking crash. The boat seemed to shiver and keel over to port. A half-dozen room stewards and I rushed out onto the promenade deck and peered into the starlit darkness. We could see what appeared to be a sail or something white standing out off our starboard side, astern. In a letter written to his family and later published in the New York Sun, first-class passenger Hugh Woolner said that it had become so deadly cold in the restaurant and lounge that he and a few other men retreated into the first-class smoking room. Woolner and his companions had only just sat down when the collision occurred. Quote, there came a heavy grinding sort of shock beginning far ahead of us in the bow and rapidly passing along the ship and away under our feet. Everyone sprang up and ran out through the swing doors astern. A man in front of me called out that he had seen an iceberg towering 50 feet above the deck, which was 100 feet above the sea, and passing away astern. So not only was first-class passenger Vera Dick still awake at the time of the collision, she told the Washington Post that she was on deck when it happened. Vera gave the following statement less than a week after the incident. Quote, the night on which the big steamship Titanic crushed out its life against the iceberg juggernaut was very clear, and there was a tang in the air. I was on deck and was almost thrown from my feet by the shock of the collision. I have heard it said that the sinking of the Titanic was caused by an explosion in the engine room. This is untrue. I saw the iceberg that brought down the Titanic.
Can you imagine being able to say that?
Wow. No, 100 feet above, what it was, 100 feet above the,
so
50
if it's
feet
50
above.
feet above the deck and they're thinking it's 100 feet above the water line,
or even below the water, because it was 90. What is it? 90 feet tall, 100 feet tall.
Well, now here's the thing: it's about 70 feet from the boat deck to the water. So, but keep in mind, I very much doubt that they've got the ship dimensions in front of them. They're
right.
estimating,
Right.
But still, for it to be up above the ship,
There's a whole bunch of ice below.
that's a lot of ice.
That's a lot of ice.
Yes. So for those who had already gone below for the night, the vast majority experienced Titanic's collision with the iceberg completely blind. There are some accounts wherein a passenger looked out their porthole at the exact right moment as something white passed by. There are some who said that pieces of ice broke off and fell into their stateroom, but most passengers recalled being awoken out of slumber with no definitive explanation as to what had happened. So you'll notice that the following quotes rely heavily on metaphors as the passengers attempted to process, describe, and explain the unknown disturbance. First-class passenger Helen Otsby said she had just nodded off when she was, quote, awakened by a jar that felt about as it would if you were in a car that scraped the side of a tree. First-class passenger Ella White was sitting on her bed, reaching to turn out the light when the collision happened. She observed, quote, it did not seem to me that there was any very great impact at all. It was just as though we went over 1,000 marbles. Conversely, first-class passenger Eleanor Casebeer said she, quote, felt the full impact of the iceberg when we struck it. It sounded as if something were grinding and tearing away the very entrails of the monster liner.
Wow. I mean, the way they're describing this, I mean, this is something you would never hear. And just, you think about what they experienced, what they heard. I mean, how it's like, how would you put
How do you
words
put that
to
into
it?
words?
How do you put it into words? So, I mean, the marbles, 1,000 marbles? Wow.
Which I'm trying to think of. I mean, my children are really big into the marble run at home. That's loud with 20 marbles.
Yeah.
I'm just saying.
Wow.
First-class passenger Norman Chambers and his wife occupied one of the lowest, furthest forward first-class staterooms on the starboard side of the ship. I'm going to say that again, because that was a complicated sentence. It's the lowest, so we're talking not on A or B deck, we're talking E deck. Furthest forward, so we're going towards the bow, of the first-class staterooms on the starboard side of the ship.
So they're closest to the impact. Or
Of the first-class passengers, anyway. Because keep in mind, there would have been third-class passengers closer into the bow, but of the first-class staterooms. So from this vantage point, Norman testified before the U.S. Senate inquiry saying, quote, at the time of the collision, I was in bed and I noticed no very great shock, the loudest noise by far being that of jangling chains whipping along the side of the ship. This passed so quickly that I assumed something had gone wrong with the engines. And second-class passenger Charlotte Collier placed the time of collision shortly after the bedroom stewardess had warned her that the ship was going through the devil's hole.
Oh, no, the devil's hole.
We're back to the devil's hole. She said, and then crash. The sensation to me was as if the ship had been seized by a giant hand and shaken once, twice, then stopped dead in its course. I was not thrown out of my berth, and my husband staggered on his feet only slightly. We heard no strange sounds, no rending of plates on woodwork, but we noticed that the engines had ceased running. They tried to restart the engines a few minutes later, but after some coughing and rumbling, there was silence once more. Our cabin was so situated that we could follow this clearly. And we've got second-class passenger Lawrence Beasley, who was peacefully reading in bed when he observed, quote, there came what seemed to me nothing more than an extra heave of the engines. Nothing more than that. No sound of a crash, no sense of shock, no jar that felt like one heavy body meeting another. The thought came to me that they must have still further increased the speed. And so, with no thought of anything serious having happened to the ship, I continued my reading. There was no cry in the night, no alarm given, no one afraid. There was then nothing which could cause fear to the most timid person, but in a few moments I felt the engine slow and stop. The dancing motion and the vibration ceased suddenly after being part of our very existence for 4 days, and that was the very first hint that anything out of the ordinary had happened.
You think about it, for 4 days you had for 24/7, you had the hum of the engines, you had that feeling, you could feel it in the, I think a couple episodes back, we had mentioned someone sitting on his bed, he could feel the springs. Anyway, so yeah, all of a sudden have that, come to a stop in the middle of the ocean.
So the closest example I could think of is we lost our AC last summer, and I didn't notice it because the house got warmer. I noticed it because all of a sudden it was like, why is it so quiet? Like, I had never noticed my air conditioner until it was no longer running, and then there's just this deathly silence through my house.
Oh, yeah. So, the things that are around you that you don't pay attention to all of a sudden when they're gone, it's like, wait a second, what's different? So I can imagine that. You can imagine what that must have felt like. Like when I was a kid, I used to fall asleep in the car when my parents would drive us somewhere with that vibration of the car, Well, when they stopped, it stopped and I'd wake up.
Yeah.
So
All
yeah.
my kids do that.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's a family thing.
Yeah.
Well, for some, the disturbance was so minor that they did not even feel the need to get out of bed. For others, curiosity led them out of their staterooms, but only so far as the corridor. So first-class passenger Margaret Brown was lying in bed reading as well, but she had a more intense experience than Beasley. Margaret said, quote, "So completely absorbed in my reading, I gave little thought to the crash that struck at my window and threw me to the floor. Picking myself up, I proceeded to see what the steamer had struck. On emerging from the stateroom, I found many men in the gangway in their pajamas. One of them remarked, 'Are you prepared to swim in those things?' referring to the pajamas. Women were standing along the corridors in their kimonos. All seemed to be quietly listening, thinking nothing serious had occurred, though realizing at the time that the engines had stopped immediately after the crash and the boat was at a standstill, and there was no confusion of any kind, the book was picked up again. On overhearing the occupants of the adjoining stateroom say, 'We will go on deck and see what has happened,' I again arose and saw 6 more stewards and 1 officer in the corridor, forcing an auger through a hole in the floor while treating the whole thing with levity. Again returning to my book, presently I saw the curtains moving, but no one was visible."
So even after seeing 6 stewards and an officer, which that seems like an awful lot of people, congregated in the corridor, Margaret is still not worried enough to do more to investigate what's going on.
That's it. Yeah, that's interesting, because first of all, you had people that they felt it so differently. There's a Beasley that was saying, I felt nothing, and here Margaret is thrown out of her. Almost.
Which again, because you think about second class versus first class, you would have assumed that the first class passengers would not have experienced much, but Margaret says she was thrown to the floor.
And that's interesting that she's thrown to the floor. There's all those people, and yet she's going back to her room, or back to bed and back to reading. Well, it was a very, very cold night. So I think that, that could have played a part in as well. Because if you think about it, if it's bitterly cold and something happens, I think I'm going to let my confirmation bias tell me, hey, it's okay.
Everything's fine, I'm sure.
Everything's fine. I'm going to get back under those warm covers.
Everything's fine. Everything's good.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, though. So the comment about the curtains moving, this is something that's being quoted by Titanic historians as evidence that the ship did in fact progress. We had just talked about one of those. Charlotte Collier had made a comment that after some coughing and rumbling, they tried to restart the engines a few minutes later. Believe it or not, there's a lot of argument about this. There is a lot of dispute. Did Titanic stop her engines immediately after collision and stay stopped? Or did she restart and then stop? And if she did restart, how long did she stay restarted and for what purpose?
Interesting. Well, I know you and I have talked about this, and there's several quotes that say that it did restart again.
Yes.
There's no time frames, but it's interesting there'd be a discrepancy or disagreement or whatever you may want to call it about it starting and stopping, or did it not start a second time? There's people that said it did start a second time.
There's quite a few.
Yes.
So for those that are in the she didn't restart camp, but that's, again, they're able to point at things. But people, I'm sorry, I feel like if you don't mention that she restarted, you can't prove something by the absence of a quote. I'm just saying. Maybe they didn't write it down. But anyway, I digress.
Okay. Well, first-class passenger Mahala Douglas gave the following description during the U.S. Senate Titanic inquiry. Quote, "The shock of the collision was not great to us. The engine stopped, then went on for a few moments, then stopped again."
Just saying.
There you go. "We waited some little time, Mr. Douglas reassuring me there was no danger before going out of the cabin. I waited in the corridor to see or hear what I could. We received no order. No one knocked at our door. We saw no officers or stewards. No one to give an order or answer our questions." So
that would be very, I don't know, does that set you at ease? If you pop your head out and there's not a problem, then you wouldn't see someone.
Well, I would have to agree. It's hard to say how I would have reacted because I'm a kind of person where I look at evidence around me. And if something happens that's a one-off and I don't know what to make of it, and I look around, I don't see evidence of anything really being a problem, I don't know. I may have gone back with being cold.
Yes.
I may have very well gone back to bed, picked up a book, or stayed warm in my nice warm cabin. So it's hard to say. But interestingly, first class passenger Elizabeth Schutz smelled the iceberg before the collision, and she wrote, quote, "Such a biting cold air poured into my stateroom that I could not sleep, and the air had so strange an odor as if it came from a clammy cave. Suddenly, a queer quivering ran under me, apparently the whole length of the ship. Started by the very strangeness of the shivering motion, I sprang to the floor. With too perfect a trust in that mighty vessel, I again lay down. Somebody knocked at my door, and the voice of a friend said, 'Come quickly to my cabin. An iceberg had just passed our window. I know we just struck one.' No confusion, no noise of any kind. One could believe no danger imminent. Our stewardess came and said she could learn nothing. Looking out into the companionway, I saw heads appearing, asking questions from half-closed doors. An officer's cap passed the door. I asked, 'Is there an accident or danger of any kind?' 'None so far as I know,' was his courteous answer, spoken quietly and most kindly. The same officer then entered a cabin a little distance down the companionway, and by this time, distrustful of everything, I listened intently and distinctly heard, 'We can keep the water out for a while.'"
So with Elizabeth's comment about smelling, the strange odor, like a clammy cave, this kind of reminds me of Vera Dick commenting on the tang in the air.
Mm-hmm.
Could they be referring to the same thing?
I've never been around I've not been in saltwater iceberg. I've seen them. I just don't. I've flown over them, but I've never been in the water with them. So I'm not. That's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking frozen salt water. And it's, I don't know. It may be.
I don't know.
It's hard I've never experienced that. It's hard to say.
So while aboard the Carpathia, first-class passenger Cornelia Andrews recorded her experience for a friend in New York, saying, quote, "It was about midnight when the crash came and we were all in bed. They told us there was no danger, and as we had no moment's suspicion that such a magnificent ship could be sunk, we all went back to our beds without a fear." First-class passenger Lucy Duff Gordon did not have to leave her stateroom to overhear the following conversation between two passengers. Quote, "I had been in bed for about an hour when I was awakened by a funny rumbling noise. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before. It seemed almost as if some giant hand had been playing bowls, rolling the great balls along." I'm assuming she means bowling.
Right.
Then the boat stopped, and immediately there was a frightful noise of escaping steam, and I heard people running outside my cabin, but they were laughing and gay. "We must have hit an iceberg," I heard one of them say. "There's ice on deck." "Don't be ridiculous," he said. "Even if we've grazed an iceberg, it can't do serious damage with all these watertight compartments. The worst that can happen is that it will slow us down. Go back to bed and don't worry."
So the same watertight compartments that they said were not working properly?
The doors that were not responding?
Yes, yes.
But I wonder how many people knew about that.
Yes, well, yeah.
So for many of the passengers, the crew's reassuring words and calm demeanor convinced them to return to bed. However, not all passengers were placated. Like Norman Chambers, first-class passenger James McGow's stateroom was also located on Upper Deck E on the starboard side of the ship. He gave the following affidavit to the U.S. Senate inquiry. Quote, "I was awakened at 11:40 p.m. ship time. Soon after leaving our stateroom, we came in contact with the second dining room steward, of whom we asked the question, 'Is there any danger?' And he replied, 'Not in the least,' and suggested that we go back to bed. It was our intention to go up to the promenade deck, but before doing so, I rapped on the door of the stateroom opposite mine, which was occupied by a lady, and suggested to her that she'd better get up at once and dress, as there was apparently something wrong." First-class passenger Martha Stevenson had spent her evening in the lounge, ironically, looking at pictures of icebergs and ice fields in a book about the South Pole. You can't make this stuff up,
They're
man.
in the Devil's Hole, and she's looking at a book about...
You can't make this stuff up, man.
That'd be like an airplane looking at something about plane crashes.
No. Never. She remembered being roused out of sleep by the collision. Quote, "At 12:15, I was awakened by a terrible jar with ripping and cutting noise which lasted a few moments. We soon heard voices in the hall, so that Elizabeth put on her wrapper, slippers, and cap and ran out. I was bitterly cold and shivering from fright and cold, sat undecided what to do. Our steward came down to close the port, and I asked him if the order had been given to close all the ports, but he said, 'No, it's only cold, go to bed, it's nothing at all.' I decided to get dressed, explaining to Elizabeth I should feel much safer with my clothes on. I could go to bed later if all was all right. Mr. Thayer appeared at our door, saying he thought there was no danger, but we had struck ice and there was much on deck, and he urged us to come up and see it. We then left our room, leaving the electric lights on, also the electric heater, so that it would be warm on our return.
Yes, I can imagine it. Like, it's cold. You can't tell me the cold didn't have something a part to play in all this.
I think it's interesting that Martha says she is frightened. She says she's shivering from the cold and from fright. She's advised by a fellow passenger that Titanic has struck ice. She still believes that she will be returning to her room and that the situation is not so serious that they'll have to abandon ship. And another interesting point in this passage I found is that while the stewards are sticking with the party line of nothing's wrong, the passengers are starting to pass word along to one another that something's up.
There may not have been at this point in time. We'll talk about the crew, later, but it's so early on and it just happened. So they may not have known. There was not a comprehensive or information from the crew's perspective that everyone would have shared at that moment. So
right.
It just would have been where you were when it happened, what you saw, those type of things. So
absolutely,
yeah, I thought it was interesting that the passengers started, passing word along to one another and warning, and
it's more of an informal communication system at this point for sure.
Yeah. So certain first and second class passengers took the situation seriously from the very first moment, either because they were experiencing an inexplicable, overwhelming feeling of dread or because they had previous personal experience with disasters at sea. First class passenger Marie Young wrote down her recollections shortly after Titanic sank. In fact, she did so while sitting in the Carpathia's library. In her account, she credited a friend's instincts as having saved them both. Quote, I had just switched off the light over my bed when the ship struck with a grinding, wrenching force, followed by several violent bumps. My friend Mrs. White and I thought we had struck a small boat, and she urged me to go with her immediately to Deck A, where the promenade deck was situated. Since sailing from Cherbourg, Mrs. White had been confined to her bed with a sprained ankle and wrist, but she had not made the effort to leave her stateroom immediately. Had she not made the effort to leave our stateroom immediately, our lives might have been lost, for it seems certain many passengers perished in their staterooms, as very few report being called.
She was worried enough to get up on a sprained ankle.
Yes.
When she had not been inclined to get up to see the wonders of Titanic the 4 days previous.
Yeah, that is, she definitely was, there was some fear there, and there was something driving her to get moving. So similarly, first class passenger Gretchen Longley attributes her survival to her aunt, Cornelia Andrews. Gretchen remembered, quote, I was in my stateroom when the Titanic struck the iceberg. After the shock, I went out into the corridor twice. Each time things were so quiet that I thought there was no reason for alarm. My aunt, Mrs. Cornelia Andrews, however, was nervous. She insisted that something had happened. As a result of her persistence that things were wrong, we went up on deck. I think there were people on board the ship when she sunk who died without knowing that she struck and who did not realize anything was wrong until the water rushed into their staterooms. That is sad.
That breaks my heart.
If you think about it, people, if they were so confident in the ship and there was nothing going on that would give them any cause for worry or concern, and they went back to bed, and the next thing your stateroom is filling full of water,
and you wake up to that,
and no one is giving you a warning, and you wake up to that.
Oh, it'd be so horrid.
That would absolutely be terrible. Second class passenger Esther Hart did not need anyone to warn her of the potential danger. She had been an anxious traveler the entire trip. She later wrote, quote, all of a sudden there came the most awful sound I'd ever heard in my life, a dreadful tearing and ripping sound, the sound of great masses of steel and iron being violently torn, rent, and cut asunder. I was on my feet in an instant, for I knew something dreadful had happened. I shook Ben, saying, Daddy, get up at once. We have hit something. I'm sure it's serious. Poor dear Ben. He was partly asleep still. He went up in his nightshirt and bare feet. In a few moments he was back again. He said, all the men are at the lifeboats. It's only a lifeboat drill. I said, they don't have lifeboat drills at 11 at night. I tell you, something's happened. Dress quickly and let us dress the baby.
I'm telling you right now, this would be me and my husband right here. They don't do lifeboat drills, just like, get up.
Yeah, there you go. So, it's interesting that, here they could actually hear, I believe it was 1-inch steel. So for it to
Lord.
rip, the sound, if you were close enough,
Grinding, tearing,
yes,
ripping. These are all the very consistent words that are
yes,
used.
that would be quite the sound, quite the noise. So
So after arriving in New York, first-class passenger Martha Sitdone sat down with a friend and dictated her experience on Titanic. She said, quote, I had gone to bed when the crash came, but I was not asleep. It was not a terrific crash at all. I've traveled extensively, and it was no worse than is often caused by some trivial accident to the machinery. I knew we were in the vicinity of icebergs, and so I slipped on a kimono over my nightdress and went out of my stateroom into the corridor. I spoke to a ship's officer standing near my door and asked him if we had not run into an iceberg, which this is the first person now who's calling it out. Yes, he answered, but there is no danger. Go back to bed and go to sleep. All this time the steam was blowing off with a terrible noise, and I asked him why they were doing it. We have stopped to see what damage is done, but there is not the slightest danger, he reiterated.
wow.
So this is the first time that an officer or member of the crew has confirmed the presence of an iceberg, at least that we've read. And it was only after specifically being asked about it, not just a general question about an accident or an issue.
Well, and once again, the unsinkable Titanic and the the watertight compartments, and the thought process that this huge, beautiful floating hotel is like terra firma, it's like being aground. So everything around you is telling them, hey, it's okay. It's cold outside. Go back to bed. You know, I mean, like I said, would I have gone back to bed? I mean, I probably would have looked around and thought, hey, you know, it's cold outside. I'm going to go back to bed. So unless I had some more evidence, like some of the passengers had.
So unlike the first 4 nights of the voyage, first-class passenger Colonel Archibald Gracie had gone to bed early on Sunday night. This gave him the advantage of nearly 3 hours of invigorating sleep by the time of the collision. Gracie remembered, quote, I was enjoying a good night's rest when I was aroused by a sudden shock and noise forward on the starboard side, which I at once concluded was caused by a collision with some other ship, perhaps. I opened the door of my cabin, looked out in the corridor, but could not see or hear anyone. There was no commotion whatever, but immediately following the collision came a great noise of escaping steam. I listened intently but could hear no machinery. There was no mistaking that something wrong had happened because of the ship stopping and the blowing off of steam. So this is the second quote we've heard about the steam. Let's discuss it just a little bit more.
That would have been a very loud sound. You know, I worked in the nuclear industry, and during outages, we would have to release the pressure from the reactors and the system to be able to work on the refueling. And it is extremely loud. I mean, earplugs. You could be a quarter mile away, and you're wearing earplugs.
So yeah, that really blew my mind because my thought when I was doing the research, they talk about how loud it was up on deck, but I figured once you went inside, you wouldn't hear it quite so much. But there are quotes that are saying that it could be heard all the way throughout the ship.
I would say inside it would be a little better, but if you were outside, it would have been deafening. It would have been very, very loud. It would have been uncomfortably loud. And I thought when he had talked earlier about some quotes, they did talk about it being something like uncomfortable or something like, I don't know if that's, I haven't seen.
I know Jack Thayer, the loudness on deck really bothers Jack Thayer and stuck with him all those years later.
Yes, it is very loud. It is very disturbing to just stand there and not protect your ears from listening to that. It is, yes, I personally have experienced that. I did not care for it. So when I put my earplugs in, I walked that quarter mile, and it got a little bit better out there. So, but no, it was still very, very loud. So I can only imagine what it must have been like that night for them on that ship to be just with all this going on and that loud sound, no vibration. Yeah, that would have been
It would have been disconcerting.
Yeah, it would have been. Yes, it would have been.
So first-class passenger Henry Harper had seen very little of the Titanic after coming on board due to a bad case of tonsillitis, which what a bummer.
Oh, yeah.
You get your passage on like the finest ship in the world, and you basically are
And you're sick
the whole time.
Oh, that's terrible.
Little did he know how much time he would soon be spending on deck. He wrote the following account after arriving in New York, quote, I was fast asleep when the Titanic struck. My first knowledge about it was that My first knowledge about it was that of being awakened by a grinding sound that seemed to come from far below our deck. It was not a loud crash, but was felt almost as much as heard. But years before, I had been in a ship that ran over a reef and sunk, And I remembered that the impact and thrill then were so slight that I thought we were simply running over a fishing smack that bumped and scraped under our keel. So the moment I was awakened by the noise and heard the same sort of sound, I sat up in bed and looked out the nearest port. I saw an iceberg only a few feet away, apparently racing aft at high speed and crumbling as it went. I knew right away what that meant. Get dressed quickly, I told my wife. We must go on deck.
Oh my goodness! So, being part of a shipwreck before, and now,
Oh,
yeah.
so here's some context for this passage. Turns out that in 1902, Henry Harper had survived a shipwreck. The vessel on which he was traveling hit an iceberg off the coast of Newfoundland and sank.
Oh, no.
Ironically, that shipwreck it happened in the same part of the Atlantic through which the Titanic was now traveling.
Oh, my good
This
day.
must have been the worst kind of deja vu for him.
My goodness.
So Henry Harper's initial reaction to the collision on the night of April 14th was born out of a very personal experience.
Oh, he must have been thinking, "What in the world?"
What you said
Again?
earlier about about a lightning striking
Oh, lightning
twice.
striking twice. Yeah, lightning. I mean, lightning struck this guy. Yeah, I mean, twice.
Oh man, he's like, I'm never sailing
I'm
again.
not. Yeah, I'm not sailing again.
Not doing
no,
it.
no.
First class passenger Major Arthur Buchan spent his evening in the smoking room chatting with fellow passengers until a little after 11:20. He testified, quote, I had only reached my room and was starting to undress when I felt as though a heavy wave had struck our ship. She quivered under it somewhat. If there had been a sea running, I would simply have thought it was an unusual wave which had struck the boat, but knowing that it was a calm night and that it was an unusual thing to occur on a calm night, I immediately put on my overcoat and went up on deck. As I started to go through the grand stairway, I met a friend who have said, why, we have struck an iceberg.
Well, there's passengers telling passengers about what's going
Yeah.
on.
And Puchin is a self-described yachtsman, and you can tell from the observations that he makes and the way that he kind of analyzes the factors of the situation that he does have personal experience with sailing, so he knows what's normal and what isn't.
Yes, he does. So, however, other passengers that climbed up to the higher decks in search of answers were inspired by a sense of curiosity or a sense of adventure as opposed to believing that something was wrong. 17-year-old first-class passenger Jack Thayer wrote in his memoirs, quote, I wound my watch. It was 11:45 p.m. and was just about to step into bed when I seemed to sway slightly. I immediately realized that the ship had veered to port as though she had been gently pushed. If I had had a brimful of a glass of water in my hand, not a drop would have been spilled. The shock was so slight. Almost instantaneously, the engine stopped. The sudden quiet was startling and disturbing. Then there was the distant noise of running feet and muffled voices as several people hurried through the passageway. Very shortly, the engine started up again, slowly, not with the bright vibration to which we were accustomed, but as though they were tired. After the very few revolutions, they again stopped. I hurried into my heavy overcoat and threw on my slippers. All excited, but not thinking anything serious had occurred, I called in to my father and mother that I was going up on deck to see the fun. So here he's talking about the engine starting for a second time, and his quotes are a lot of attention to detail as to what was going on around him.
He was a very observant young man.
Very observant. So, that's a good indication to me that the engine started a second time.
And the Jack Thayer, he wrote his own memoirs after the fact. I want to say 1940s, if that might be correct. Anyway, on primarynerd.com, we will be having the sources, and his book is like $7 on Amazon. I think it's maybe 100 pages or so. It's a very good read.
Okay. So checking back in with second-class passenger Lawrence Beasley, he had made the decision to go investigate, not because he was concerned, but due to curiosity. He remembered, quote, but the stopping of the engines gave us no information. We had to make our own calculations as to why we had stopped. Like a flash, it came to me. We have dropped a propeller blade. Acting on it, I jumped out of bed, slipped on a dressing gown over pajamas, put on shoes, and went out of my cabin into the hall near the saloon. I must confess I felt rather absurd for not remaining in the cabin. It seemed like making a needless fuss to walk about the ship in a dressing gown. But it was my first trip across the sea. I enjoyed every minute of it and was keenly alive to note every new experience. And certainly to stop in the middle of the sea with a propeller drop seemed sufficient reason for going on deck. And I can see that. You see something, that's not something you'd see every day.
No.
Especially.
Well, and nobody thinks this will be Titanic's last hours on Earth. They think she's going to be going into New York. This will just be part of the Titanic story. You could say that you were on deck. You got to see the propeller.
Got to see the propeller,
exactly.
Yeah. But if it, I mean, by then it probably was at the bottom of the ocean if it fell off. So.
Right, but they could watch what the crew does, that sort of thing.
True. Yeah, there's not a whole lot you can do from a dinghy when you got a propeller that's, those propellers are huge.
No. So let's pause for a moment. As you can see, there were varying levels of knowledge among the passengers regarding the collision. It was not common knowledge that Titanic had struck an iceberg. In fact, the passengers that witnessed it for themselves formed a very small percentage of those on board. And at this time, the crew was not openly acknowledging what had happened. But as you said, Dad, many of them probably weren't even fully aware of what had happened.
Yes.
But they were quick to reassure any curious passengers that there was no danger and to please return to bed. As we've heard from various passengers, some were only too willing to believe that all was well, considering that Titanic was the unsinkable ship. Mm-hmm. This is an excellent example of confirmation bias, which is defined as the tendency to interpret new evidence as confirmation of one's existing theories or beliefs.
And I can understand that. Guys, I mean, if you think about it and you're in the middle of the Atlantic, the ship is stopped, it's freezing cold, you're in your nice warm bed, you're not going to, you want to think everything's fine, I'm going to go back to bed, it'll get going, we're okay.
And that's also, for those people that were already inclined to believe that, everything that they saw confirmed what they thought.
Yes.
For those people that were already nervous, like Esther Hart, she stayed dressed the entire voyage. Like, she never undressed. It was kind of a thing. Mm-hmm. And I think that she was the one, if I remember correctly, she would actually stay up at night because she wanted to be keeping a lookout for her family. And then she would sleep in kind of during the day and get up for lunch. It was a full thing. So when they say she was an anxious passenger, or when I said she was an anxious passenger, I wasn't joking. And so for her, she was absolutely convinced something bad would happen. So when something happened, she was convinced, here it is, it's arrived.
And she was right.
Well,
we all experience this to some degree. Like flying in an airplane is a great example. I mean, how many times have you flown and the plane is smooth, you're sitting there, you're reading a book, you're listening to music, watching a movie, you think nothing of where am I, until all of a sudden the turbulence happens and you're getting thrown around. And I've been in, only twice in my life have I been in turbulence that really it made me wonder if we were going to make it. Only twice. And at that moment in time, I knew very well that I was on an airplane. But until then, I just didn't think about it, because you see it around you. I'm sitting in a chair. I'm sitting inside of a not a cockpit, but in the cabin. You see the things around you, and you just equate them to, I'm safe, I'm in my living room at home.
Is as it should be.
Yeah, as it should be, right. And on the Titanic, this thing was so huge, it was like on terra firma, like that one reporter had stated. So it's so big and so beautiful and so just solid.
And palatial.
Yeah. So
and you've got not just the crew, but you've also got the newspapers, the magazines, and those people that are in the the nautical world, the maritime world, that are saying what an achievement this boat is of how safe she is.
Right, so all of that's around you. So of course, I can see where the confirmation bias would come in. There's no excitement around me. I don't see anybody panicking. Yeah, there was a weird noise. Yeah, it's a propeller or whatever. It's cold.
You kind of choose. You know what? I'm not going to borrow. I'm not going to borrow trouble. Right. There's that shoulder shrug of.
Yes.
Meh.
Yeah. So yeah, I've experienced that to some degree in certain areas of my life. So yeah.
So something that stood out as I was reading through the passengers' letters was how often the most actionable information came from fellow passengers, not crew members. It was fellow passengers who knocked on their neighbors' doors to awake and alert them to the possible danger, thus making sure that the friends they had made aboard the ship were not left behind. And as we just said, there were varying levels of knowledge amongst the passengers about what was happening. The amount of information that an individual passenger possessed influenced their initial response and subsequent actions. Although they did not know it yet, their choices and actions would very soon directly affect their chance of survival.
Wow. Yeah, that's so true. The choices that they made from the information that they knew.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And that's one of the really important parts about the story that I wanted to focus on, because it's all well and good to sit here in 2023 and look back and be like, well, why didn't they pay attention to this? But it doesn't mean that just because this person had that piece of information does not mean that that person had it. So standing with them, at this point, we are climbing up on deck with those few passengers who decided to investigate the unknown disturbance for themselves. The majority of the first and second class passengers are still below decks, either A, waiting for someone to come back with an explanation, or B, still fast asleep. For the passengers that went on deck in hopes of excitement, they were quickly disappointed. As they looked out into the darkness, they could not see anything that explained the collision, and the only evidence that anything had happened was the scattered ice on shelter deck C, which many of the passengers didn't even notice until somebody else pointed it out.
So let's pick back up with second-class passenger Lawrence Beasley, who recorded, quote, I climbed the 3 flights of stairs, opened the vestibule door leading to the top deck, and stepped out into an atmosphere that cut me, clad as I was, like a knife. Walking over to the starboard side, I peered over and saw the sea many feet below, calm and black. Forward, the deserted deck stretching away to the first-class quarters and the captain's bridge, and behind, the steerage quarters and stern bridge. Nothing more, no iceberg on either side or astern as far as we could see in the darkness. So he saw several other men arrive on the boat deck to investigate, one whom Beasley recognized, so they gathered a group to discuss and to compare experiences. Beasley wrote, quote, none of us could see anything, and all being quiet and still, the Scotchman and I went down to the next deck. Through the windows of the smoking room, we saw a game of cards going on with several onlookers, and went in to inquire if they knew more than we did. They had apparently felt rather more of the heavy heaving motion, but so far as I remember, none of them had gone out on deck to make any inquiries, even when one of them had seen through the windows an iceberg go by towering above the decks. He also called their attention to it, and they all watched it disappear, but had then at once resumed the game.
Which I'm just like...
Can you imagine?
I'm picturing what that looks like, and you're just like, oh, no, okay, it's your turn.
Yeah, it's an iceberg, yeah.
Oh, I got 31.
Yeah. So continuing with Beasley's quote, we asked them at the height of the berg, and some said 100 feet, other 60 feet. We accepted these estimates and made guesses as to what had happened to the Titanic. The general impression was that we had just scraped the iceberg with a glancing blow on the starboard side, and they had stopped as a wise precaution to examine her thoroughly all over. I expect the iceberg has scratched off some of her new paint, said one, and the captain doesn't like to go on until she's painted up again. We laughed at his estimate of the captain's care for the ship. One of the players, pointing to his glass of whiskey standing at his elbow, and turning to an onlooker, said, just run along the deck and see if any ice has come aboard. I'd like some for this. So seeing that no more information was forthcoming, I left the smoking room and went down to my cabin, where I sat for some time reading again. So he goes back, he hears us about the icebergs, and he's back to his room reading.
Yep, no, I wanted to break this down. So Beasley began his investigation believing that nothing serious was wrong. If anything, he's excited. He goes out onto deck. He did not see the iceberg or any evidence of it while on deck. He's advised by others that an iceberg was seen. The witnesses even confirmed that the ship collided with it. But the witnesses' attitude was jovial and calm. So Beasley concluded that no further action was needed on his part, and he returns to his cabin to read again.
Wow.
Now we're going to be comparing this to the next person, which is Colonel Archibald Gracie. But before we go here, I want to make a quick note, because for me, I'm very interested in kind of being able to move spatially through Titanic. And so looking at the deck plans and trying to figure out, okay, where would you go from here? Would you turn right or left? That sort of thing. So when Beasley's up on the boat deck and then he says he goes down to the next deck and he goes in to talk to people in the smoke room, I was really confused, because if you just think about it in terms of going down the decks, it go boat deck and then promenade deck A. However, there's no second-class public rooms on promenade deck A. So he wouldn't have had access to it because of those companionways. The second-class companionway from the boat deck goes through promenade deck A and it goes down to bridge deck B. And that's where the second-class smoking room was. So that's where Beasley would have been during this conversation for anybody that was confused.
Those companionways that definitely kept people where they wanted them to be.
Exactly.
It kept a flow and the certain classes and
yes,
and where they wanted them to end up as they transversed around the...
And
Sure.
if you're able to kind of follow those companionways, it's easier to kind of follow in the footsteps of various people as they move through the ship.
That makes sense.
So we're moving on, and we're going to be comparing Lawrence Beasley's account with first class passenger Colonel Archibald Gracie. So he also had to climb up 3 decks to reach the boat deck. He was forward on the port side of an almost empty deck with only one young lad who was seemingly bent on the same quest for information. Gracie remembered the 2 of them staring out into the darkness and trying to determine what could have caused the disturbance. He recorded, quote, "If another ship had struck us, there was no trace of it, and it did not yet occur to me that it was an iceberg with which we had collided. Not satisfied with a partial investigation, I made a complete tour of the deck, searching every point of the compass with my eyes. Going towards the stern, so this would be going aft on the ship, I vaulted over the iron gate and fence that divide the first and second cabin passengers." So he's moving from the first class upper promenade deck on the boat deck into the second class open promenade on the boat deck. Going towards the stern, vaulted over the iron gate and fence that divide the first and second cabin passengers. I disregarded the not allowed notice. I looked about me towards the officers' quarters in expectation of being challenged for non-observance of rules. In view of the collision, I had expected to see some of the ship's officers on the boat deck, but there was no sign of an officer anywhere, and no one from whom to obtain any information about what had happened. Having gained no satisfaction whatever, I descended to the glass-enclosed deck A port side and looked over the rail to see whether the ship was on an even keel, but I could still not see anything wrong. Entering the companionway at the foot of the stairway were a number of men passengers, and now for the first time discovered that others were aroused. Wow. Back it up.
Yeah.
Having gained no satisfaction whatever, I descended to the glass-enclosed deck A port side and looked over the rail to see whether the ship was on an even keel, but still could see nothing wrong. Entering the companionway at the foot of the stairway were a number of men passengers, and I now for the first time discovered that others were aroused as well as myself, among them my friend Clinch Smith, from whom I first learned that an iceberg had struck us. He opened his hand and showed me some ice, flat like my watch, coolly suggesting that I might take it home for a souvenir. While we stood there, the story of the collision came to us, how someone in the smoking room when the ship struck rushed out to see what it was, and returning, told them that he had a glimpse of an iceberg towering 50 feet above Deck A, which, if true, would indicate a height of over 100 feet. Here, too, I learned that the mail room was flooded and that the plucky postal clerks in 2 feet of water were at their post. They were engaged in transferring to the upper deck from the ship's post office the 200 bags of registered mail containing 400,000 letters.
Wow, 400,000?
400,000
That's part of that $2.2 million contract they had.
Yes.
Wow.
They know what's up.
Wow.
And now Clinch Smith and myself noticed a list on the floor of the companionway. We kept our own counsel about it, not wishing to frighten anyone or cause any unnecessary alarm, especially among the ladies, who had then appeared upon the scene. We did not consider it our duty to express our individual opinion upon the serious character of the accident, which now appealed to us with the greatest force. He and I resolved to stick together in the final emergency, united in the silent bond of friendship, and lend a helping hand to each other whenever required. We agreed to visit our respective staterooms and join each other later.
Yeah, so he did notice a listing.
He did.
He did notice a list to it.
So we're going to break this down the same way we did it for Beasley. So remember, Beasley went out. He didn't see anything. He doesn't see any evidence. People tell him that they see it. They tell him that it collided. And he chooses to go back to bed and read. For Gracie, he began his investigation believing something serious had happened. He did not see the iceberg or any evidence of it on deck. He was advised by others that 1, an iceberg had been seen, and 2, the mailroom was flooding.
Wow.
He was shown some of the ice that had fallen on board and personally felt the ship listing. Gracie concluded that the ship and all aboard her were in danger and started making contingency plans with a friend.
I would too. I mean, you start feeling a list of they better, something's happening.
So comparing these two primary accounts, it's really interesting. The information that Beasley and Gracie gleaned from their investigations, which was based on what they saw for themselves or heard from others, was almost identical. Now, except for the listing. Gracie talks about the listing pretty quickly, but spoiler alert, Beasley later notices the listing too.
But he doesn't mention it now.
Not at this point. He does not mention it at this point. But the two men arrive at exact opposite conclusions and take exact opposite actions.
I know like you and I talked about just the situational awareness. You know, you can have two people in the same circumstance walking through an area, and someone will notice something and the other person may not. So in the listing, I would imagine would have been very small at the beginning, and then it would have gotten greater as time went
goes on.
Right. So at first, you know, maybe Mr. Gracie is very very astute, very sensitive to that the listing. He could feel it, sense it, see it. Some way he knew it. And maybe Beasley just wasn't that way. And maybe it took a little bit more of the listing for Beasley to get to, oh my goodness, yeah, there's something here. So it's just hard, you know, it's hard to say how they knew or what they knew when they knew it. But, you know.
It's so rough.
But different people, we pick up things differently. We're all different. So, but the bottom line is eventually they both did come to that. They knew that the ship was listing.
I also see this still as an evidence of the confirmation bias. Beasley went into this thinking nothing's wrong, everything's cool, and so that's the conclusion he came to. Gracie went into it saying something's up, something's wrong, and I'm going to find out what it is.
And you know, that's very true. That when you go into a situation, you tell yourself everything's fine, even if you see something that's not, you're gonna miss it. You won't see it.
Well, there's confirmation bias. There's also something called an anchoring bias, and this is really prevalent in the area of true crime, that it's this idea, and it's a problem with juries, is that the first set of information or the first argument or whatnot that gets presented, if somebody kind of grabs onto it, they anchor with it, and they will not be dissuaded. No matter how much evidence is presented to them, they have anchored in this opinion, and they ain't moving.
Oh, I can see that. There's things in my life that I've done that myself. I can certainly see it. But I like to think that if given enough evidence, you can change my mind. At least I'd hope so. If you give me some good evidence that can.
But it also depends on the person and what kind of evidence and.
True. So let's go back to first class passenger William Sloper. He's the lucky man who got to play bridge with Dorothy Gibson and then saw something white pass by off Titanic's starboard side. He then retreated from the cold deck and came into the promenade deck, a companionway where it was warmer. This places him in the same area of the ship as Colonel Archibald Gracie and James Clinch Smith while they were making their contingency plans.
Which I kind of like to imagine them passing one another, and because we've seen all these little snippets of the story, but now you can kind of see them coming into contact with one another. And
Yes. Within a few minutes, Sloper remembered that, quote, frightened-faced people commenced to appear, many scantily attired, inquiring anxiously as to what had happened. They told him that the ship had struck an iceberg, but as it was apparently a glancing blow, that it could have not done much damage and that there was no danger. However, he remembered feeling, quote, not so sure about there being no danger. So as most other passengers were coming up the stairs, he went against the flow of traffic and descended the first-class companionway to his stateroom so that he could grab a heavy overcoat and his pocketbook. When he left his cabin, he noticed that, quote, the floor seemed uneven and the ship was listing toward the starboard bow. On his way back up the first-class companionway, Sloper ran into his bridge companions, including Dorothy Gibson, and they congregated with the others on Promenade Deck A. Sloper noticed, quote, many more people had appeared on deck, some clad only in nightclothes and dressing gowns. There was no confusion, however, or anything resembling a panic. The stewards assured everyone who asked them that the watertight bulkheads were closed, and while there was a hole in her, she could not possibly sink. And many who had gone out of bed to ascertain the trouble returned satisfied. We went back into the companionway, and Miss Gibson, who had only just recovered from an attack of nervous prostration.
I would assume that's like an anxiety attack.
Anxiety attack? Thank you. And was greatly alarmed and excited, stopped everyone as they came out from the lower deck and asked them if there was any danger. The designer of the Titanic, who was aboard, came rushing up from below at this minute, and although he said nothing about the seriousness of the trouble, one look on his face convinced me he was worried.
So with the appearance of Thomas Andrews out of his stateroom, the passengers went to him for information and reassurance. First-class passenger Eleanor K. Spear had ventured up to the promenade deck soon after the collision because she felt that something was, quote, radically wrong. She wrote, I hurried on deck where I met Harry Anderson, a fellow passenger, and together we made our way to the bow of the boat where we found a litter of small particles of ice which were torn from the iceberg by the force of the impact. We could see the berg towering some 75 to 100 feet out of the sea. Here we also met Thomas Andrews. In answer to many questions, he assured everybody that we were absolutely safe and that the Titanic was absolutely unsinkable. He said that she could break into 3 separate and distinct parts and that each part would stay afloat indefinitely.
Where in the world did he come up with that?
Indefinitely.
Yeah, so she broke into 2 parts, right?
She did. Although some people argue about that too.
Do they?
Oh, yes, we'll get into that too.
Well, bottom line, she broke into more than one part.
Well, I mean, some people disagree. You're already getting into fighting words.
Okay, then
okay.
okay.
Evidence from the ocean floor, she broke. I'm just going to
Spoiler
spoiler alert.
We'll leave it at that.
All right. First class passengers Albert and Vera Dick also had a conversation with Thomas Andrews in the first few minutes after the collision, which they later summarized for the New York Herald. They said, quote, he, Thomas Andrews, was on hand at once and said he was going below to investigate. We begged him not to go, but he insisted, saying he knew the ship as no one else did and that he might be able to allay the fears of the passengers.
You can only imagine what must have been going through his mind. I mean, brand new ship and so intimately involved with every aspect of it.
When he referred to the ship as his baby,
Yeah,
he had to have been like, "Oh no!"
You know, that had to have been quite an experience for him. I mean, if you really think about it, what the whole mindset of unsinkable, the whole mindset of this brand new, beautiful, the first voyage, and to have something like this happen, and then him find out how serious it was. I mean, that would have been I can't even think of the words.
It hit him very hard.
Yes. So by this time, those first-class passengers who had come up to investigate were congregated in the expansive foyer at the base of the grand staircase on Promenade Deck A, or in one of the nearby public rooms. As the main first-class companionway, this was a prime location to observe the movements of Thomas Andrews, Bruce Ismay, Captain Smith, and the officers of whom were being closely scrutinized for any information. As first-class passenger Helen Otsby recorded, quote, I remember seeing Captain Smith and 1 or 2 other officers coming down the main staircase to explore the ship and see what damage had been done. The officers looked very sober. They didn't stop to talk to the passengers at all. So, before heading down to his stateroom to fetch his overcoat, first-class passenger Colonel Archibald Gracie distinctly remembered seeing Bruce Ismay. He wrote, quote, I passed Mr. Ismay with a number of the crew hurrying up the stairway. He seemed too much preoccupied to notice anyone. Therefore, I did not speak to him, but regarded his face closely, perchance to learn from his manner how serious the accident might be. It occurred to me then that he was putting on a brave face as possible so as to cause no alarm among the passengers.
So because of how ill first-class passenger Henry Harper was, it took him and his wife a long time to make their way all the way up to the boat deck. He recorded, quote, we walked very slowly up the steps of the big stairways, for I was pretty weak, and when we got to the next deck above, I sat down on a lounge and rested 5 or 6 minutes. Then we climbed up to the next deck, and so on. At last we got up to the gymnasium, which was on the top deck. Men and women were standing about in groups talking. I have heard some talk since about excitement, but I saw none then. They all seemed curious, not a bit anxious. Everybody seemed confident that the ship was all right. She certainly seemed all right. The engines had been stopped soon after we struck, and by this time she had slowly lost headway and was standing still. The sea was quiet, a flat calm, but all the ship's lights were lit, and there was not a suggestion of excitement anywhere. A few people were talking about the lifeboats, but they were laughed at. Lifeboats, said a woman near me. What do they need of lifeboats? This ship could smash 100 icebergs and not feel it. Ridiculous. After a little time, word was passed among the passengers that we'd better go back to bed. The ship will be delayed 2 hours, the steward said, and then go on to New York. At this, a great many people went away from our neighborhood. Whether they went back to bed or not, I don't know, but I can't remember seeing their faces again. They dropped away a few at a time, casually drifted off. The reassurance that the ship would be delayed only 2 hours seemed to satisfy the curiosity of most of them, though, and the crowd soon dwindled. However, there were still a few dozen of us left in our neighborhood on the upper deck. Clearly, the Harpers had no intention of returning to their stateroom. Remember, Henry had survived a shipwreck 10 years previously and was very aware how dangerous the situation could be. First-class passenger Lucy Duff Gordon made an astute observation about the consequences for those who followed the crew's advice to return to bed. She said, quote, "Several other people hurried up on deck, but on hearing from a ship's officer that it was nothing but temporary trouble, they went quietly back to bed. I think to this day that had it not been for this ill-advised reticence, hundreds more lives would have been saved. As it was, the appalling danger we were in was concealed from us until it was too late, and in the ensuing panic, many lifeboats were lowered half filled because there was no time to fill them." So, Lucy's analysis is spot on, and it's been reinforced by Titanic historians Tad Fitch, J. Kent Layton, and Bill Wormstead in their absolutely incredible book, On a Sea of Glass, The Life and Loss of the RMS Titanic. So for me, these historians, they've essentially written like the Bible of Titanic knowledge. It's absolutely incredible. And if you're going to invest in one all-encompassing book about Titanic, this would be it. In my notes, they're just referred to as Flow for Fitch, Layton, and Wormstead. They have asserted, quote, "During the minutes directly following the collision in first, second, and third classes, both above and below deck, not only were the passengers being assured nothing serious had happened, but they were also being told to go back to their staterooms and to go back to sleep. It is possible that for some of those who went back to sleep, particularly those in third-class sections of the ship forward, this delay subsequently allowed them to become trapped by incoming water or without enough time to save themselves."
Oh, my goodness.
There was an unshakable faith in Titanic's unsinkability among the passengers and crew, the consensus being that even if the Titanic was taking on water, she could not sink. So while a few dozen first-class passengers either remained on the boat deck or were mingling on Promenade Deck A, everyone else returned to bed. And I want to highlight that based on the information available to the passengers at this point, there was no logical reason not to.
Yeah, if there was no general warning being put out by the crew, if there's no any directions being given, what the people are seeing, they're not seeing anything. So it all just fits into what they're seeing around them, and remember, it's cold.
They're going off the evidence.
They're going off the evidence, and they're going to go back to their room. And some people may not have ever been warned or been told that there was the danger that was coming. So those passengers that returned to their cabins did so for several reasons. The upper decks were almost unbearably loud because of the steam blowing off. It was biting cold. It was so cold. There was nothing to see and nothing to do. It was late, and the crew said it was safe to do so. So those are some really good reasons.
Those are some good reasons. Yeah, I would be convinced by those reasons.
Yeah. So loud,
my
cold,
book's waiting for me.
Nothing's happening.
I've got my wine glass in there.
Yeah. So at the urging of his wife, first-class passenger Norman Chambers had gone up to Promenade Deck A to investigate. But there was nothing to see, and he noted only an unusual coldness of the air. So he chose to return to the warmth of their stateroom. He testified, quote, "Upon returning to the stateroom, I found a couple of mail clerks wet to their knees who had just come up from below, bringing their registered mail bags. As the door of the bulkhead in the next deck was open, I was able to look directly into the trunk room, which was then filled with water, and was within 18 inches or 2 feet of the deck above. We were standing there joking about our baggage being completely soaked and about the correspondence, which was seen floating about the top of the water. I personally felt no sense of danger as this water was forward of the bulkhead. While we were standing there, 3 of the ship's officers descended and looked into the baggage room, coming back immediately, saying they were not making any more water. This was not an announcement, but merely a remark passed from one to the other. Our steward came by and told us that we could go back to bed again, that there was no danger. In this, I agreed with him personally." So here we have water.
Mm-hmm. A lot of water.
A lot of water, and they're assuring him it's okay.
I mean, it's within 2 feet to 18 inches of the ceiling. So they're looking down the stairs into a room, and there's only just that little bit of clearance between the water and the ceiling of that room.
Wow.
With the letters floating on
That
top.
would make me very nervous. I don't care.
Yeah.
I don't care what anybody says. That would make me nervous.
Yes.
So as we mentioned earlier, second-class passenger Lawrence Beasley decided to return to his cabin after chatting with the men in the second-class smoking room. But he didn't stay below decks long. As he heard more and more people walking down the corridors and questioning the bedroom stewards, Beasley couldn't resist going back on deck. On this trip to the boat deck, Beasley noticed, quote, "There were now more people looking over the side and walking about, questioning each other as to why we had stopped, but without obtaining any definite information. I stayed on deck some minutes, walking about vigorously to keep warm and occasionally looking downwards to the sea as if something would indicate the reason for delay. The ship had now resumed her course, moving very slowly through the water, with a little white line of foam on each side. I think we were all glad to see this. It seemed better than standing still. I soon decided to go down again. As I was crossed from the starboard to the port side to go down by the vestibule door, I saw an officer climb on the last lifeboat on the port side and begin to throw off the cover. But I do not remember that anyone had paid any particular attention to him. Certainly no one thought that they were preparing to man the lifeboats and embark from the ship. All this time, there was no apprehension of any danger in the minds of passengers, and no one was in any condition of panic or hysteria. After all, it would have been strange if they had been, without any definite evidence of danger. As I passed to the door to go down, I looked forward again and saw to my surprise an undoubted tilt downward from the stern to the bows. Only a slight slope, which I didn't think anyone had noticed. At any rate, they had not remarked on it. There was something unusual about the stairs, a curious sense of something out of balance, and not being able to put one's feet down in the right place. I could not see any visible slope of the stairway. It was perceptible only by the sense of balance at this time.
So remember earlier when we were talking about Colonel Gracie, and he's talking about the list that he's discerning. This is Beasley discerning that list. So it's interesting. So when Beasley comments that he seems to be the only one who had noticed it, or if others had noticed it, they were keeping it to themselves. And if you're getting that sense of deja vu, it's because Colonel Gracie said almost the exact same thing about if people are noticed it, they're not saying anything about it. So this had raised a couple questions for me. Did Gracie perceive the listing earlier in the night, and Beasley only noticed it when the degree became more pronounced? Or did Beasley and Gracie perceive it at about the same time, but it only seems later because Beasley has been up and down between the decks a few times. So it just seems like he's further along in the timeline.
Well, and he wasn't as concerned as Gracie.
Yes.
And
very true.
And if you notice what he said here, he said it's not something that he saw, it's something he felt.
Yes.
So it could be a little bit more, could have been a little more listing. It could have been something a little more pronounced that he would have kind of taken him by his feeling. He could feel the imbalance. It could have been that.
That seems to be what it is that it's just like, it's not quite right.
Not quite. Well, yeah, you know what it feels like when you're going downstairs.
Yes.
I mean, do you remember going downstairs in our old house? Remember how narrow they were?
Yes.
You remember?
They were very steep.
Very steep. So just imagine if that started would have been going down at the base.
It's like a fun house at a fair. You're like, oh.
Yeah. So no, I can imagine that he felt it. So that tells you there was quite a list going on, that he could actually feel it, the change in the listing.
So let's continue on with Beasley. After carefully descending the tilting stairs, he noted, quote, "On my way to my cabin, I passed some stewards standing unconcernedly against the walls of the saloon. It is no exaggeration to say that they had neither any knowledge of the accident nor any feeling of alarm that we had stopped and had not yet gone again at full speed. Their whole attitude expressed perfect confidence in the ships and officers. Turning into my gangway, I saw a man standing at the other end of it fastening his tie. 'Anything fresh?' he said. 'Not much,' I replied. 'We are going ahead slowly, and she's down a little at the bows, but I don't think it's anything serious. Come in and look at this man,' he laughed. 'He won't get up.' I looked in, and in the top bunk lay a man with his back to me. 'Why won't he get up? Is he asleep?' I said. 'No,' laughed the man, dressing. 'He says,' but before he could finish the sentence, the man above grunted, 'You don't catch me leaving a warm bed to go up on that cold deck at midnight. I know better than that.' We both told him laughingly why he had better get up, but he was certain he was just as safe there, and all this dressing was quite unnecessary."
All right, so I think the cold had quite a bit to play with it too. If it had been a warm night, circumstances could have been different for these people. They may have thought differently. They would have maybe been more curious to get out. But being cold,
More willing to stay out.
More willing to stay out. So, like Beasley, first-class passenger Dr. Washington Dodge had ventured multiple times out of his stateroom to investigate the disturbance. The first time he went as far as the forward companionway when he was told by a passing officer that something had gone wrong with the propeller, but that it was nothing serious. After sharing this tidbit with his wife, they both agreed that the propeller explanation made no sense. The shock they felt seemed more like an object striking the side of the ship. The second time he ventured out from their stateroom, Dr. Washington Dodge chronicled, "This time I went from the companionway out into the promenade deck, where I found a group of possibly 6 or 8 men, who were gaily conversing about the incident. I heard one man say that the impact was due to ice. Upon one of his listeners questioning the authority of this, he replied, 'Go up forward, you can see for yourself.' I at once walked forward to the end of the promenade deck. As I stood there, an incident occurred which made me take a more serious view of the situation than I otherwise would. 2 stokers who had slipped up onto the promenade deck unobserved, said to me, 'Do you think there's any danger, sir?' I replied, 'If there is any danger, it would be due to the vessel having sprung a leak, and you ought to know more about it than I.'"
Which is Mr. Sassy Pants.
Yeah. They replied in what appeared to me to be an alarmed tone, "Well, sir, the water was pouring into the stokehold when we came up, sir. At this time, I observed quite a number of steerage passengers who were amusing themselves by walking over the ice and kicking it about the deck. No ice or iceberg was to be seen in the ocean, not observing any sign of apprehension on the part of anyone, nor seeing any unusual number of persons on any part of the ship. I again returned to my cabin and told my wife what I had seen and heard."
So it's important to note that Bruce Ismay very deliberately kept stokers, firemen, and other below-decks personnel as far away from the guests as possible. They even had a special tunnel through which they moved between their sleeping quarters and their workstations, just specifically so they would never be seen. So for these stokers to have snuck up to the first-class promenade deck and approached a passenger because they were concerned says a lot.
Well, and they're saying the water was pouring in. That is, I would be concerned. That would have me concerned. I see, there is definitely signs that something's not right, but still, it's the unsinkable ship, the watertight compartments, the hype that went into her.
Well, and honestly, I think there's also that feeling of, as a customer, you expect things to go a certain way. You expect that if you've purchased a product, it works. That if you are going if you're traveling, that mode of transportation is safe, or that there are contingency plans, or you will be in good hands. Somebody will be taking care of you.
Yes. So that definitely, I'm sure that was a mindset in some of the passengers' minds.
Yes. So, wrapping up, it is just before midnight on Sunday, April 14th, 1912. Most of the first and second class passengers who left their staterooms to investigate the unknown disturbance have already returned to their cabins as instructed by the crew. There are some who have chosen to remain on the boat deck, but most, of the first class passengers anyway, are mingling in the public rooms on Promenade Deck A. Some passengers have noticed that the ship is listing, but they seem to think it's bad manners to say anything about it. So, this whole kind of excitement is winding down. Yes, everybody came up, midnight excursion, but they're going to bed, and the passengers think that this chapter of their voyage is over. But it's only just beginning, which we will get into next episode.
Well, thank you very much for your hard work on it. You have certainly put a lot of effort and time and research.
This was previously written, and then I went back and was like, do it over.
Yeah.
So I'm very pleased with how this one came together.
Well, we want to tell the story in a manner that flows and is understandable and is accurate, and get this historical information about what these people experienced during this horrific
And I really
event,
want to paint the picture. I want you to be able to see them as well as you can as they move through the ship.
Yes. So I just want to mention that to get a hold of us, please, you can send an email to theprimarynerdpodcast@gmail.com, or you can also leave a comment at theprimarynerd.com. You can also see our podcast episodes, listen to them there, and you can leave a comment there as well. So we do want your comments, feedback, ideas, anything you've got to add to the conversation. We'd appreciate it.
We're going to be done with Titanic. I mean, granted, we still probably have at least 3 or 4 more Titanic episodes, but Mama's going to need to start researching the next topic. So if somebody's got an idea, I mean, trust me, my bookshelves are full, but if somebody has an idea and it gets me going, it could be the next episodes.
Yep, we need your help. We need your input to help us just to make this a better podcast, and to just expand out into many different areas. I mean, we were talking, could be historical, could be something newer. I mean historical as in, like this, it could be not so much in the
Not in the early 1900s.
1900. It could be older than that. It could be, anything that strikes your interest.
I went to a local used bookstore recently, and I walked away with just bags of primary sources. It was very exciting. I mean, it's 75 cents. I mean, how do you say no to that?
There you go.
So,
all right. Well, with that, I look forward to getting together with you next time, but we need to sign off. So with that,
I'm Courtney.
I'm Brian.
And this is The Primary Nerd.